Welcome to World War II Stories for Sleep. Tonight there is nothing urgent for you to do. There is nowhere you need to go. There is no task waiting for you in the dark. You can let the day fall away. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your hands rest. Let your breathing become slower than it was a moment ago. You do not need to hold every name. You do not need to follow every mile of ocean. You do not need to remember every ship. The story will carry those things for you. If sleep comes before the end, that is all right. This is not a battle documentary. This is not the loud version of Midway. This is not a story told through explosions, victory speeches, or arrows moving across a map. Tonight, we enter the quiet hours before dawn, the night of June 3rd into June 4th, 1942, the Central Pacific, far northwest of Hawaii, far from city lights, far from familiar shores, out where the ocean is so wide that even great ships seem small. The modern room around you can begin to fade now. The walls soften, the present moves back, the air becomes warm and salted, the floor beneath the story becomes water, black water, deep water, endless water. The Pacific at night was not empty. It only looked that way from above. At the surface it was black as ink, a long, breathing darkness under stars. Where a ship's propellers churned it, the water woke for a moment and glowed green. Tiny living lights opened in the wake, then closed again. The glow trailed behind a hull, trembled, broke apart, and disappeared into the dark. The ocean did not keep the mark for long. She had no need to remember every passing ship. She was older than the ships, older than the flags, older than the orders folded inside chart rooms, older than the men who crossed her with dog tags against their chests and photographs in their wallets. Here, near the tropics, the Pacific was warm at the surface. The night air was soft. Salt hung in it. A ship moving through that air carried its own weather. Oil, metal, coffee, cigarette smoke, canvas, rubber, aviation fuel, damp wool, and the slow human heat of men sleeping in narrow compartments. Above the ocean, stars held their places with a hard brightness. The Southern Cross sat low, almost resting on the horizon. Clouds passed in quiet layers. The moon, when it came through, laid a pale road on the water and then took it away again. Nothing in the sky showed what the morning would become. There was only the wide night, warm enough, dark enough, quiet enough. And somewhere inside that darkness, Midway waited. Midway Atoll was a small thing in so much ocean. A ring of coral and pale sand, two low islands, Sand Island, Eastern Island, barely lifted above the sea. From a great distance, it could seem like a mistake in the water, a thin mark, a reef, a few palms, a runway, a handful of buildings, radio masts, fuel drums, sandbags, tents, wooden structures, men trying to sleep, men keeping watch, men trying not to think too far ahead. The atoll sat about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Around it, the Pacific reached outward for more miles than the mind could easily hold. A man on Midway could walk across parts of the island quickly. He could hear the surf from more than one direction. That was the first strange lesson of the place. The sea was never somewhere else. It was always near, past the buildings, past the runway, past the palms, past the fuel drums, past the sandbags. It circled everything. It sounded against the reef all night. A steady break, a pause, a withdrawing pull, then another fold of water. On Sand Island, the smell of the night was salt, coral dust, aviation gasoline, engine oil, warm canvas, sweat, tobacco, old wood, tinned food, and seabirds. The birds belonged there more than the men did. The Marines called them gooney birds, Laysan albatrosses. They stood awkwardly on the sand, walked with serious patience, cried into the dark, and rose into the air with a clumsy effort that somehow became grace once their wings had found the wind. They had owned Midway long before the runway, long before the war, long before any officer looked at a map and placed a finger on the tiny atoll. They did not know that men far away in Pearl Harbor had listened carefully to radio waves. They did not know about Station Hypo. They did not know that code, patience, and fragments of information had made Midway important before the ships ever came near it. They knew the reef. They knew the wind. They knew their nests. They knew the white sand under starlight. That was enough. A Marine named Samuel Price stood near a sandbagged position and watched one of the birds cross the path in front of him. He was 21 years old, from Ohio. Before the war, the largest water he had known well was a lake. Now he lived on a coral ring in the middle of the Pacific. He still had trouble explaining the size of the ocean in letters home. He had tried. "The sea is everywhere here," he had written. Then he had crossed it out because it sounded too obvious. A few lines later, he had written something better. "The island is so small that you can walk across it before you're done thinking about breakfast." That line had stayed. The letter was still unfinished. It sat folded in the pocket of his shirt beside a pencil stub and a small photograph of his younger sister standing by a fence. The photograph had been creased at one corner. He noticed that crease whenever he looked at it. It bothered him in the way small damage bothers a man far from home. The picture itself mattered because it proved that somewhere beyond the ocean there was a fence, a yard, a house, a girl with one hand shading her eyes, and a day that had nothing to do with aircraft, fuel drums, or night watches. Samuel looked down at the gooney bird. The bird paused. It turned its head slightly, as if judging his right to stand there. Samuel said softly, "Evening." The bird gave him nothing, no greeting, no concern. It moved on across the sand with slow authority. Samuel accepted this. The birds had seniority. Near the runway on Eastern Island, men were still working. Night did not stop maintenance. Aircraft waited under dim light. Some were covered, some opened, some being checked by tired hands. Tools lay in careful rows. A truck rolled slowly along the edge of the field. A flashlight beam moved beneath a wing. Somewhere, a mechanic called to another man and received a short answer. The runway itself lay flat and pale in the darkness. By day, it was harsh with glare. At night, it became a quieter line between ocean and sky. It did not sleep. It waited. A mechanic named Owen Brooks sat on a crate near a toolbox and rubbed the back of his neck. He had oil under his nails, aviation fuel on his sleeves, salt drying on his face. He had been awake too long to enjoy sitting, but sitting was still better than standing. A canteen rested by his boot. A mess tin lay upside down near the crate, catching a faint shine from a lamp. Across the field, a PBY Catalina rested near the water, long-winged, heavy, patient. It looked almost peaceful in the dark. The Catalina was not a graceful machine in the way smaller aircraft could be graceful. It was large, slow, and stubborn. A patrol plane built for distance, built to search water that did not wish to be searched. Men had been sending Catalinas out from Midway to look across the emptiness, to scan the sea for wakes, for silhouettes, for the faint straight lines that ships leave behind them when moonlight or dawn is kind enough to show the trace. Most searchers found nothing. Nothing still mattered. In the Pacific, nothing could be a report. Nothing could mean a sector had been watched. Nothing could mean the ocean had kept its secret for another hour. Inside one Catalina, a pilot named Daniel Reeves sat under the green glow of instruments and checked a note clipped near his knee. He was 27, old enough to seem steady to younger men, young enough to feel the weight of the night in his stomach. The cockpit smelled of leather, oil, warm metal, canvas, salt air, and coffee that had already cooled. His observer, Ellis Morgan, adjusted his headphones and leaned toward the dark outside the glass. The search would be long, hours of engine drone, hours of black water, hours of looking for something smaller than the ocean wanted to reveal. Daniel had a photograph tucked near his map case, his wife on a porch. A dog blurred in the lower corner because it had moved at the moment the picture was taken. He liked that blur. It made the photograph feel alive. He touched the edge once, then put his hand back on the work in front of him. Course, fuel, sector, time, a line on a map, a real ocean beneath it. The aircraft began to move into its task. The engine settled into a low, steady drone. The sound filled the body until it no longer seemed separate from thought. A patrol plane at night was a narrow room travelling through endless space. Green instruments, black windows, cold coffee, a cigarette saved for later, a pencil across a navigation plot, a hand near a switch. A voice kept low because there was no reason to speak loudly inside so much darkness. Daniel listened to the engines. Ellis looked out. Below them, the Pacific opened like a black field with no edges. Back on Sand Island, Samuel Price heard the Catalina pass into the night. The drone faded slowly, not gone all at once, only swallowed by distance. He stood for a while after it had disappeared. then looked toward the runway again. The island was awake in small pockets. A radio hut glowed. A man crossed between buildings. A truck engine coughed, caught, and rolled away. A gooney bird cried from somewhere beyond the low structures. Inside one hut, a Marine wrote a letter on his knee. Inside another, a man slept with his boots still on. Outside, a sentry shifted his weight and looked toward an ocean he could not see clearly but could always hear. The surf on the reef, bird cries in the dark, a generator's soft, uneven rhythm, tools being set down near the runway, the distant drone of a patrol plane, fuel smell, salt on the lips, warm coral dust under boots, tobacco smoke near a doorway, the Pacific breathing beyond the reef. The night continued without hurry. Far northeast of Midway, the American carriers moved through the same dark. USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, USS Yorktown, Task Force 16 and Task Force 17. Admiral Raymond Spruance was at sea with Task Force 16. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher was at sea with Task Force 17. Admiral Chester Nimitz was not on those decks. He remained at Pearl Harbor, where decisions, intelligence, and the work of listening had already shaped the placement of ships in this immense ocean. But on the carriers, the night did not feel like a decision in a headquarters. It felt like engines, watch rotations, coffee, tools, maps, aircraft, tired men. The carriers were roughly 300 miles northeast of Midway, moving through the dark as floating cities. Each ship had its own weather inside. Enterprise carried the smell of aviation gasoline and hot metal through her hangar deck. Hornet held ready rooms where pilots slept poorly under red lamps. Yorktown, repaired in haste after Coral Sea, moved with fresh work still visible in her steel. To the Pacific, even these carriers were small. To the men aboard them, they were whole worlds. A carrier at night is not silent. It breathes, it vibrates, it murmurs through pipes and vents. The boilers push heat through the ship. The screws turn beneath the water. The wake trails behind in faint green light. The hangar deck holds aircraft in shadows. The flight deck lies open under stars. The radio room listens, the bridge watches. The galley keeps coffee moving. Berthing compartments fill with the uneven breathing of sleeping men. On Enterprise, a mechanic named Walter Ames stood beneath the wing of a Dauntless and checked a panel he had already checked twice. He knew he had checked it. He also knew that knowing was not the same as being done. A tired mind could skip. A tired hand could fail to notice what it touched. The man who would fly the aircraft later would not be thinking about Walter. He would simply trust that the work had been done. That trust made Walter check again. His flashlight beam moved over rivets, seams, a fastener, the edge of the panel. Good. He touched the metal with 2 fingers. Not affection, not superstition exactly, only the habit of a man who spoke to machines through contact. Another mechanic nearby counted tools. The count came up short. The men paused. They searched beneath a rag, under a step, near the tyre, along the edge of a toolbox. The missing tool appeared where no one had put it, which is where missing tools often go. They counted again, all present. Only then did the younger mechanic breathe out. Walter said, "Now it's done." The younger man said, "You said that before. I was optimistic. Dangerous habit. Useful in small amounts." They were too tired to laugh fully. A small smile passed between them and vanished. That was enough. The hangar deck around them held Wildcats, Devastators, and Dauntlesses in low light. Men moved carefully between wings and carts. The smell of fuel, oil, rubber, paint, salt air, coffee, sweat, and warm metal settled into everything. A parachute pack rested on a bench. A life vest had been inspected and placed aside. An oxygen mask hung from a hook. A map case lay beneath a folded leather jacket. A coffee cup stood on a crate, forgotten and cooling. A pencil rolled once when the ship moved, then stopped against a boot. These were small things, but small things made the night human. On Hornet, a ready room had gone quiet in the way a room goes quiet when many men are not fully asleep. A red-shaded light burned low. It kept the darkness soft without ruining the eyes. Pilots lay in chairs, across benches, on the deck, wherever there was space. Some had flight jackets over their chests. Some had maps under one arm. Some slept with shoes still on. Some did not sleep at all. The room smelled of leather, wool, cigarette smoke, paper, coffee, sweat, and stale air. A pack of cards sat open on a table. A folded letter lay beneath a navigation chart. A dog tag rested against the throat of a sleeping man, rising and falling with his breath. Jack Ralston woke before anyone called him. He did not know why. The ship had not changed sound. No one had spoken his name. The red light was still there. The same man still snored softly in the corner. The same map lay on the same table. Jack stayed still for a moment and listened to the carrier, the low thrum, the distant metal sounds, the soft shift of sleeping men. Then he reached into the pocket of his leather flight jacket and touched the photograph there, his father and brother beside a car. Back home, the picture had seemed ordinary. At sea, it had become a small room he could enter for a second. He did not take it out. He only checked that it was there. On the table, his unfinished letter waited under the edge of a map. Dear Dad, the coffee here is strong enough to count as a mechanical fluid. That was all he had written. It was not much. It sounded like him. That was enough for now. He closed his eyes again. Sleep did not come at once, but it came for a little while. On Yorktown, the repairs from Pearl Harbor still lived in the ship's surfaces. Fresh paint in places. New work where old damage had been patched. A carrier can return to sea before she has finished remembering what happened to her. Men aboard Yorktown knew that. They did not need to say it often. The ship moved through the Pacific with the steadiness required of her. Inside a berth compartment, hundreds of men slept in layers of canvas and steel. The air was close. Socks, soap, sweat, coffee, wool, canvas, and metal. A canteen rolled slightly with the motion of the ship, then settled. A wristwatch glowed faintly beside a folded shirt. A man turned over and pulled a blanket tighter. Another muttered a word no one understood. The breathing of so many men made the room feel almost alive. Not peaceful, not uncomfortable enough to wake everyone, only human. Yorktown kept moving. In her radio spaces, men listened through static. In her hangar spaces, men checked aircraft. On her catwalks, men stood for brief moments of air. One sailor leaned against the rail and looked at the wake. The propellers churned the Pacific into a faint living green. For several seconds, the ocean seemed lit from within. Then the glow broke apart and disappeared. He watched it fade. Another sailor came beside him. Neither spoke for a while. The first man said, "Looks like it remembers us." The second said, "Not for long." They stood together, looking into the dark. Then they went back inside. The fleet moved with lights controlled, voices low, and every watch aware of the size of the sea around them. Cruisers and destroyers held their places around the carriers. A destroyer at night felt closer to the water than a carrier did. The waves spoke more loudly against its hull. The deck rose and fell more sharply. A lookout stood with binoculars and watched a horizon that gave almost nothing back. He saw cloud shadow, a star low over water, the faint shape of another ship where it should be, then only blackness. A lookout's work was patience pointed outward. He waited. He watched. He drank coffee that had gone cold. He watched again. Nothing unusual, only the long discipline of a night watch at sea. The Pacific held all of them. The carriers, the destroyers, the cruisers, the patrol planes, the little atoll, the gooney birds on their sand, the men in Pearl Harbor far behind them, still connected by radio waves and decisions. Every ship left a wake. Every wake faded. Every man carried some private object the ocean did not understand. A wallet photograph, a lucky charm, a wristwatch, a letter folded twice, a harmonica in a kit bag, a pencil, a map, a slide rule, a cigarette saved for later, a coffee cup cooling in the dark. The night made these things seem larger, not because they mattered to history, because they mattered to the men holding them. Out over the water, Daniel Reeves and his Catalina crew continued their search. The first hours had passed into the middle hours. That was when fatigue changed shape. At the beginning of a patrol, the mind watches everything. The instruments, the engine sounds, the black sea below, the horizon line, the course, the fuel. Later, the danger is not panic. It is sameness. Water becomes water becomes water. 1,000 square miles can become one dark surface. The eye wants to rest. The mind wants to smooth the world. Ellis Morgan knew this and fought it quietly. He moved his gaze in patterns. Near water, farther water, horizon, cloud line, moon path, back again. He did not stare at one place too long. Staring could create shapes. Wanting could invent a wake where none existed. He wrote a time mark, no contact, then another, still nothing. Daniel drank from the cold coffee cup and made a face, Ellis noticed. Still bad. Worse now. Useful? Barely. That ended the conversation. The engines held their drone. The green instruments lit their hands and faces from below. A cigarette waited unlit in a pocket. A map vibrated gently under a clip. The Pacific below remained immense and dark. Most of the time, the search found nothing. But nothing was not useless. Nothing filled the grid. Nothing narrowed the unknown by one small piece. Nothing meant men had looked, and in that night, looking mattered. On Midway, Samuel Price finally sat down again with his letter. He wrote under a low lamp while insects gathered near the light. The paper had softened with humidity. He held it down with his left hand. Dear Mom, the island is small and the ocean is large. That is the simplest way to say it. He paused, listened to the surf and continued. The birds here walk around like they pay rent. I think they consider us temporary. That line pleased him. It felt true. A gooney bird cried outside as if confirming its authority. Samuel smiled and wrote another sentence. Do not worry if letters are slow. There is a lot of water between here and anywhere. He stopped there. There was more to say, but he did not know how to say it. He folded the letter twice, not sealed, not finished, just folded. Inside his pocket it joined the pencil stub, the photograph, and the dog tag that clicked softly when he moved. He stepped outside. The air was warm. The reef spoke in the dark. Eastern Island lay low across the atoll. Somewhere a truck shifted gears. Somewhere else, a radio voice came and went. The Marines waited with the quiet impatience of men who had prepared as much as they could. At a certain point, preparation becomes another form of waiting. Fuel checked, positions checked, aircraft checked, weapons checked, communications checked. Then the night remains. A man can only keep watch. He can only drink the coffee. Read the letter again, check the wristwatch, listen to the surf, say nothing, let the hour pass. If you are still listening, you may already be drifting. That is enough. The ocean is still wide, the island is still small, the ships are still moving beyond sight, the watch is being kept without you needing to hold it. You can rest while the night continues. The first block ends in the deep middle of the night, before dawn has changed the colour of the horizon, before the flight decks have fully awakened, before the morning becomes history. Midway lies low under stars with surf around its reef and gooney birds moving across coral sand. PBY Catalinas search the dark Pacific, their crews watching black water through green instrument light. Enterprise, Hornet and Yorktown steam northeast of the atoll, carrying aircraft, pilots, mechanics, letters, maps, coffee and unfinished sleep. The ocean holds them all with the same ancient patience. No hurry, no explanation. Only warm dark water, a faint green wake, and the slow breathing of ships beneath the stars. On Enterprise, the middle of the night had a shape of its own. It was not the same as evening, it was not yet the hour before dawn, it was the deep part of the watch. When the body wanted sleep, the mind became slower, and the ship seemed to grow larger around every man who remained awake. The carrier moved through the Pacific with steady pressure beneath her decks. Her engines did not sound loud to the men who had lived with them for days. They had become part of the ship's body, a low thrum, a tremor through soles and bunks, a rhythm under metal, wood, canvas, pipes, ladders, hangar spaces and ready rooms. The ship carried that rhythm into every compartment. A man sleeping below decks heard it inside his dreams. A mechanic on the hangar deck felt it through his knees. A lookout on the bridge accepted it as proof that the night was still moving forward. Enterprise was a city without streets, surrounded by water so dark that distance itself seemed to have vanished. There were passageways instead of roads, ladders instead of staircases, ready rooms instead of parlours, hangar decks instead of workshops and squares, galleys where coffee moved from pot to cup, radio rooms where men listened into static, chart rooms where oceans were reduced to paper, because paper was the only way a human hand could manage them. In the hangar deck, the aircraft waited under low lamps, F4F Wildcats, TBD Devastators, SBD Dauntlesses. Their names had a hard mechanical sound, but in the night they were mostly shadows, surfaces, tyres, folded wings, open panels, and work not yet finished. The men around them did not move like men in a hurry. They moved like men who knew that hurry made mistakes. A flashlight beam crossed a row of rivets. A rag moved over a patch of oil. A hand checked the edge of a panel. A pencil marked a small note on a clipboard. A mechanic counted tools under his breath. Another man checked the count without being asked. The air carried aviation gasoline, hydraulic fluid, rubber, warm metal, salt air, paint, old coffee, tobacco smoke, and the tired human smell of men who had been awake too long. Walter Ames stood near the Dauntless he had been checking since before midnight. He had told himself twice that he was finished. Then twice he had returned to one more fastener, one more cable, one more panel edge. The aircraft had no patience for a tired man's confidence. It would either work properly or it would not. The reasons would not matter to the sky. A younger mechanic named Burke watched him for a moment and leaned against a toolbox. "You keep looking at that same panel," Walter did not turn. "That is because it keeps being there." Burke rubbed both eyes with the heels of his hands. "If it was wrong, you would have found it. If it is wrong and I miss it, that sentence will not help anybody." Burke considered that. Then he bent down, picked up a small light, and held it where Walter needed it. No more conversation was necessary. The light steadied. Walter checked the panel. The fastener sat properly. The edge was clean. The wire behind it lay where it should. He closed the panel with care, pressed his fingers against it once and stepped back. The gesture was small. Not affection, not superstition, only a mechanic's way of ending a task. Burke lowered the light. "Now?" Walter looked at the tool tray. They counted again. This time nothing was missing. "Now," he said. The word did not mean perfect. It meant ready enough for the world they were in. In a ready room aboard Hornet, the red-shaded lamps made every face look softer and more tired. The room had been built for waiting, briefing, and last-minute talk. That night it had become a dormitory of bad positions. Pilots slept wherever sleep had finally found them. A man lay across two chairs with his legs hanging down. Another sat upright with his chin against his chest. Another had placed his leather flight jacket over his eyes. A fourth slept on the deck with a life vest folded under one shoulder. The room smelled of wool, leather, cigarette smoke, paper, coffee, sweat, and the stale air of men trying not to speak too much. A pack of cards lay abandoned on a table. A pencil had rolled into the edge of a map. A coffee cup stood beside an unfinished letter. Someone's dog tags rose and fell with his breathing. Jack Ralston had slept in short pieces through the night. Each time he woke, the room looked almost unchanged. The same red light, the same maps, the same sleeping men, the same ashtray, the same letter he had not finished. "Dear Dad, the coffee here is strong enough to count as a mechanical fluid." That was all. The line still pleased him a little, which made him feel foolish. A man could be sitting in the middle of the Pacific before a morning no one understood yet, and still be pleased by a sentence about bad coffee. That seemed human enough. He reached into the pocket of his flight jacket and touched the photograph there. His father and brother stood beside a car in the picture. The car was the thing they had meant to show. But since coming to sea, Jack had stopped looking at the car first. Now he looked at the hands. His father's hand on the fender, his brother's hand in his pocket. The way both of them stood as if the day were ordinary and would remain ordinary. He did not take the photograph out. He only touched it through the leather and let it stay where it was. Across the room, a pilot named Avery sat awake with a map on his knees. He was not studying it exactly. His eyes were on it, but the mind cannot always follow the eye at that hour. Lines crossed the paper. Courses, distances, search sectors, positions estimated, corrected, guessed again. The Pacific on paper was flat, pale, and obedient. The Pacific outside was none of those things. Avery traced one line with a finger, then stopped when he realized he had been doing it without purpose. He closed the map and placed it on the table. The movement woke the man beside him. "What time is it?" Avery checked his wristwatch. "Still night." "That's not a time. It's the useful answer." The man accepted this and closed his eyes again. On Yorktown, the night had a slightly different weight. The ship had been hurt at Coral Sea and repaired quickly at Pearl Harbor. There were places aboard where new work had not yet become invisible. Fresh paint, new metal, temporary neatness over recent damage. Men walked past those signs without always looking directly at them. A ship could return to sea before the memory of repair had fully settled. Yorktown moved steadily anyway. She had to. In one of her berthing compartments, sleep lay heavy over rows of men. Canvas, steel, sweat, socks, soap, wool blankets, old coffee and warm ship air. A canteen rolled a fraction of an inch with the motion of the hull and stopped against a shoe. A man shifted in his sleep and pulled his blanket closer. Another murmured one word that no one heard clearly. Near a bunk, a wristwatch sat beside a folded shirt, its faint glow nearly lost in the low darkness. The breathing of many men in one compartment became a sound of its own, uneven, soft, human. A young sailor named Raymond Cole woke for no reason and stared upward into the low dark above him. He did not know what had woken him. Not a bell, not a voice, not a change in the engines. Sometimes the body surfaced from sleep because it had been carried by the ship too long and wanted to check the world. He lay still. The carrier vibrated beneath him. Men breathed around him. Somewhere far above, the flight deck lay open to the stars. He reached for his canteen, found it by touch, took one warm swallow, and put it back exactly where it had been. Then he slept again. Yorktown continued through the dark. On the bridge of one of the destroyers in the screen, a lookout kept binoculars near his chest and watched a horizon that gave almost nothing back. A destroyer was a different kind of night from a carrier. The water felt closer, the movement sharper. The ship rose and settled with a smaller body and a more immediate voice. Spray reached places it would not reach on a carrier. Wind found its way under collars. The lookout's name was Martin Hale. He had learned to watch without staring. Staring could make the dark invent shapes. A man had to move his attention, left to right, near to far, horizon, waterline, cloud edge, back again. He saw the faint place where another ship held station. He saw a low star that looked like a light until it did not. He saw moonlight on a small wave and waited for it to stop pretending to be metal. The watch officer came near him. "Anything?" "No, sir." The officer remained beside him for a moment. The two men listened to the ship's bow working through the sea. There was nothing to add. No contact did not mean nothing was happening. It meant the dark still kept its distance. Far behind them, Midway remained small under the stars. The atoll surf moved on the reef with the same sound it had made all night. The gooney birds cried in scattered intervals, as if the island belonged to them, and the men were only temporary guests who had made the place noisy. Inside a communications hut, Samuel Price delivered a folded message and waited while a tired corporal checked it. The hut held heat, lamp glow, paper, sweat, tobacco, and the metallic smell of radio equipment. A man sat with headphones pressed to one ear. Another wrote in a log. A third leaned over a map of the atoll as if the little islands might grow larger if he watched them long enough. Samuel stood by the door and listened to the surf beyond the wall. It was strange how even indoors the ocean remained present. Not loud, not always clear, but there, a continuous reminder that the atoll was not land in the usual sense. It was a pause in water. When he stepped outside again, a bird crossed his path and forced him to wait. The bird did not hurry. Samuel almost smiled. He could imagine writing that home. The enemy may be somewhere beyond the horizon, but the birds still have right of way. He would not write it, or perhaps he would. Some lines were easier to send home than others. On Eastern Island, the PBY Catalinas were coming and going through the long night. Some were still out, some were preparing. Some men had already returned from empty searches with eyes dry from staring. A search report could feel unsatisfying when it contained nothing, but nothing was part of the work. The Pacific was too large for certainty. Most of it remained unseen, even when men crossed it with maps, compasses, and engines. Inside Daniel Reeves's Catalina, the middle hours of patrol had become heavy. At first, every flight had a beginning energy. The takeoff, the climb, the settling of course, the first careful scan of dark water. Then came the long stretch when the aircraft became a room made of vibration. Green instrument light, engine drone, coffee gone cold, leather and oil, a cigarette saved for the next hour, a map clipped in place, the dark outside barely changing. Ellis Morgan kept his eyes moving. He had learned that the mind wanted patterns too badly. A cloud shadow could become a ship, a wave could become a wake, a darker patch could become a formation. Wanting to find something was dangerous. Not wanting to find anything was dangerous too, so he used discipline instead. He looked, rested, looked again, made a note, checked the sector. looked again. Daniel watched the instruments and then the black ahead. How much farther in this leg? Ellis checked the navigation plot and answered without drama. Long enough. Daniel nodded. It was the kind of answer that was useless and true. A few minutes later, Ellis lifted his coffee cup, drank and grimaced. Cold, Daniel said. Still coffee. That may be too generous. Useful liquid then. Ellis set it down. The engines filled the space between them again. Below, the Pacific remained dark. Somewhere else in the night, another Catalina flew another line. The crew there had found nothing for hours. A pilot named James Ellery held course while his co-pilot stared into water so black it seemed to deny the existence of ships. In the rear, a crewman had a harmonica in his kit but had no desire to play. The engines already made enough sound. He touched the case once, as if checking that a small piece of another life was still with him, and left it closed. The aircraft moved on. Every man aboard knew the strange weight of searching an enormous ocean. You could fly for hours and see only water. You could return with nothing and still have done the work. You could miss something by a mile, by a cloud, by a tired eye, by a minute. The Pacific did not help. She held her surface under cloud and moonlight, letting men guess. Far northwest of Midway, under the same broad night, Akagi moved with the rest of the Kido Butai. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. 4 Japanese carriers crossing the warm Pacific, unseen by the American ships. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the force, but below the level of command the night was made from ordinary human motions. A sailor carrying a tray, a mechanic wiping oil from a tool, a pilot turning in a narrow berth, a radio operator listening through static, a cook handling rice bowls in a galley space, a watch officer looking at dark water, a man checking his wristwatch and finding that the hour had moved less than he hoped. The Japanese carriers were not shadows with one mind. They were ships full of rooms, and the rooms were full of men. On Akagi, Hiroshi Tanaka finished a cup of bitter coffee and returned to the hangar space because sitting too long made him feel colder than working even in the warm Pacific air. He passed aircraft under low lamps. He passed a young deck crewman leaning against a bulkhead with his eyes closed. He passed another mechanic holding a rag darkened by oil. No one wasted words. The work had a language of gestures, a point, a nod, a hand held up for light. A tool passed handle first. A short answer, a mark on paper. The hangar smelled of gasoline, oil, paint, rubber, metal, sweat, salt, and the kind of heat that stayed in steel long after the sun had gone down. Hiroshi checked one more fitting, then a second, then stopped. A man had to know when more checking became the same as not trusting his own hands. He stood upright and stretched his back. Above him, the flight deck lay under stars he could not see from where he stood. On Kaga, Kenji Sato sat awake beside his berth. The photograph of his mother and sister lay in his wallet. The small cloth charm remained wrapped and untouched. He had placed both inside a pocket and buttoned it closed. Beside him, another pilot slept with his mouth slightly open, head turned toward the wall. In sleep, men became younger. Kenji noticed this and looked away. He reached for a notebook but did not open it. He had written home earlier in the week. There was little new to say that could be written. The ship moves. The sea is large. I am well. I eat. I sleep when I can. Do not worry. Every wartime letter becomes a careful arrangement of truth and omission. He put the notebook back. A bell sounded faintly somewhere through the ship. The watch had changed again. Soryu's radio room held its small island of attention. Static, pencil, headphones, paper, clock. A man at the set listened without leaning too far into expectation. His job was to receive what came, not what he feared or hoped would come. The room was warm. The air smelled of equipment, paper, old smoke, and coffee. He wrote a time mark, then another, nothing that changed the hour. On Hiryu, a sailor stepped onto the catwalk for a little air and saw the wake glow behind the ship. The green light opened under the stern, streamed for a moment, and faded into black. He watched until it disappeared. Another man came out beside him carrying a cup. They stood shoulder to shoulder without speaking. The ocean made speech feel unnecessary. The night had covered both fleets with the same warm darkness. American carriers to the northeast, Japanese carriers to the northwest, midway low between them and slightly apart, ringed by surf and birds, patrol planes searching, radio rooms listening. Men in Pearl Harbor far behind, connected by intelligence work already done and decisions already made. The Pacific did not divide the night into sides. It held wakes, engines, and sleeping men with the same indifferent patience. In the Hornet ready room, the first signs of early briefing began before anyone wanted them. A door opened. Light changed. A man entered with papers and spoke quietly to someone near the front. Sleepers stirred. One pilot opened his eyes and immediately closed them again, as if the world might reconsider. Another sat up too quickly and knocked a pencil from the table. It rolled under a chair and stopped beside a boot. Jack Ralston woke with a dry mouth and the sense that he had been asleep for 1 minute or 1 hour. Both felt possible. Avery rubbed his face with both hands and reached for his wristwatch. "Time," someone answered from the front. "Not enough." That produced a few tired smiles. The red lights remained low. Maps were spread. Coffee appeared in cups that had already been used too many times. The smell sharpened the room. Coffee, cigarette smoke, paper, leather, wool, sweat, and the faint chemical edge of map ink. Men gathered around tables, not dramatically, not with speeches, with the slow obedience of bodies pulled from shallow sleep. On Enterprise, another ready room came to life in the same way. Men stood, stretched shoulders, checked watches, picked up jackets, found pencils, cleared a table. A map was weighted at the corners with a coffee cup, an ashtray, a slide rule, and someone's gloved hand. The officer speaking kept his voice level. Course, distance, search information, expected positions, midway, task force, fuel, rendezvous, return. Words that mattered, but did not need drama to carry their weight. A pilot leaned closer to see a pencil mark. Another took notes in a handwriting that would be difficult to read later. A third stared at the map and sipped coffee strong enough to make him blink. Someone had left a pack of cards on a chair. No one moved it. The cards remained as they were, a small sign of the night before the morning began. On Yorktown, Robert Hale woke before being called. He had managed perhaps 40 minutes of real sleep, which made the world feel slightly less unreal. He sat up, reached for his life vest and checked it by touch. Then the parachute pack, then the oxygen mask. Not because he expected to find anything wrong, because the hands had been trained to ask their own questions. His leather jacket lay folded beside him. He put it on slowly. The leather was stiff in the cool interior air. It smelled of salt, smoke, sweat, and machine spaces. He took his dog tags out from under the collar and let them rest again against his chest. A small sound of metal, then stillness. The ready room filled gradually. Men arriving from sleep. Men already awake. Men carrying cups. Men looking for pencils. Men pretending not to look at the clock too often. Outside the hull, the Pacific remained dark, but the darkness had begun to thin somewhere far beyond sight. No sunrise yet. No colour change obvious to tired eyes. Only a subtle loosening at the edge of the night. A sense that the deepest hours were behind them. On the PBY patrols, the same change was felt in the sky. Daniel Reeves noticed the eastern dark becoming less solid. At first it was not light, only a weakening of black. The instruments still glowed green. The water below still seemed almost without surface. Ellis kept scanning. Then he paused a fraction longer toward the horizon. "Morning's coming," Daniel looked. "Slowly. Good. Depends what it brings." Ellis did not answer. He returned to the water below. A search plane did not need philosophy at that hour. It needed eyes. The cockpit held its familiar smells and sounds. Engine drone, cold coffee, leather, oil, pencil on paper, static in headphones, breath held too long, then released. The patrol continued. On Midway, the gooney birds began to move more actively before men had fully accepted morning. They shuffled in the sand, called to one another, lifted their wings, stood in paths as if paths had been made for them first, which in some ways they had. Samuel Price walked from one hut to another with his unfinished letter still in his pocket. He had not slept enough. His eyes felt dry. His mouth tasted of coffee and salt. The sky above the atoll was still dark, but thinner now. The runway lay pale under low light. Fuel drums stood in rows. A truck waited near the field. A mechanic tightened something under a wing. The surf never stopped. It moved over the reef with patient rhythm, as if the atoll were breathing through white water. Samuel paused near the same kind of place where he had watched the bird earlier. Another albatross crossed in front of him, or the same one. He could not tell. The bird paused, turned its head, and continued. Samuel said nothing this time. The bird had already made its position clear. Across the Pacific, the carriers and patrol planes moved toward the hour before dawn. The night had not ended, but it had changed. Men who had slept were awake now. Men who had worked were drinking coffee. Men who had watched were being relieved or asked to watch longer. Maps were open. Pencils moved. Cigarettes burned down in trays. Lucky Charms remained in pockets. Photographs stayed folded in wallets. Letters waited unfinished under charts. Aircraft rested in hangars, ready enough. The Pacific held everything in darkness just a little longer. Not as mercy, not as warning, only as night. The second block rests in that hour. The deepest darkness is behind the ships now. Midway is still small under the sky. The Catalinas are still searching. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown are waking into their early briefings. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu move far away under the same fading stars. No one aboard any ship can see the whole shape of the morning. They have maps, watches, orders, coffee, and the next thing to do. For now, that is enough. The hour before dawn was the hardest hour to name. It was no longer deep night. It was not yet morning. It was the grey edge between the two when clocks mattered more than light, and men moved because they had been told the hour had come. On Hornet, the ready room had become fully awake without becoming lively. No one entered that room as if beginning a normal day. Men came out of short sleep with stiff necks, dry mouths, and the quiet caution of people trying to understand their own tired bodies. A pilot sat forward with both elbows on his knees and rubbed his face with his palms. Another pulled on a leather flight jacket that had taken the shape of him over weeks at sea. Another searched the table for a pencil and found 3, none of them his. Someone poured coffee into a metal cup and passed it down without asking who wanted it. Everyone wanted it, or at least everyone accepted it. The coffee was strong, dark and bitter. It had been standing too long. It tasted faintly of metal and smoke. It was still warmth. The red-shaded lamps made the maps look older than they were. Lines crossed the paper, course lines, distance arcs, positions estimated from reports. Midway marked as a small fixed point inside an impossible amount of water. The pilots leaned in toward the table, not eagerly, not dramatically, only because the details mattered and the light was low. Avery held his cup in one hand and tried to listen, without thinking too far beyond the next instruction. Jack Ralston stood behind him, flight jacket open, dog tags resting against his undershirt. The unfinished letter still folded beneath the edge of a map. The briefing officer spoke in a level voice. He did not try to make the words large. The sea was already large enough. He gave headings, distances, expected search information, the need for fuel discipline, the order of movement, the shape of the morning as far as anyone could know it before the morning arrived. A pilot wrote with small, careful letters in a notebook balanced against his knee. Another stared at the map for so long that Avery touched the paper near one pencil mark and said quietly, "Here." The man blinked, nodded, found his place again. There were no speeches in the room, only coffee, smoke, paper, leather, wool, pencil graphite, metal cups, tired breathing, and men trying to put the ocean into their minds. On Enterprise, the same hour unfolded differently, but with the same weight. A ready room had filled around a table. The red light softened the faces of young men who were still not fully awake. Some had slept 20 minutes, some an hour, some not at all. A few looked almost calm because they had passed beyond the point where worry showed clearly. One pilot had a pack of cards in his jacket pocket, though no one was playing now. Another kept a lucky charm tied inside a small cloth pouch. Another had a photograph tucked into a wallet and checked it once with the wallet still closed. Men have many ways of touching home without opening it. The briefing moved across the room in low sentences. A course, a bearing, a search line, a time, a return point. The words were practical. They had edges. A man could hold them. Outside those edges was everything else. The carrier's motion underfoot, the endless Pacific, the other carriers hidden by darkness and distance, Midway somewhere behind and southwest, the unknown force somewhere beyond the morning. The officer speaking did not try to fill that unknown with emotion. He only gave the work, That made the room steadier. A pilot named Thomas Avery, not the same Avery from Hornet, wrote 2 numbers on the margin of his paper and underlined one of them. His handwriting looked unlike his usual handwriting, sharper, more cramped. He noticed this and almost rewrote it, then decided the numbers were clear enough. The cup beside his hand steamed faintly. The coffee smelled stronger than it tasted. A cigarette burned down in an ashtray forgotten by the man who had lit it. Smoke curled upward into the red light. A leather jacket creaked as someone shifted in his chair. The sounds were small, but in that room they became the hour itself. A pencil scratching, a cup set down, a map corner lifted and pressed flat, a man clearing his throat, the carrier humming below them, the sea moving unseen beyond the hull. Yorktown's ready spaces were slower to wake, or perhaps the men only felt that way. The ship carried the memory of repair, and men aboard her had learned not to trust appearances too easily. A repaired ship can look steady. She can move steadily. She can do everything asked of her. Still, the men who live inside her know what has been patched, replaced, painted over, welded, and tested. Robert Hale sat with his parachute pack on the bench beside him and checked each strap by touch. He did not rush. The room around him filled with the soft activity of men preparing themselves before full light. Leather jackets, life vests, oxygen masks, maps folded into boards, headphones checked, gloves found, a canteen lifted and put down, dog tags tucked under collars, a man trying to smooth a crease from a chart that refused to obey him. Robert looked toward the room's open door. In the passage beyond, a sailor walked past carrying a tray of cups. The cups rattled softly. The sound reminded Robert of a kitchen. Not any specific kitchen. Only the idea of a room where cups were allowed to rattle because nothing depended on them. He looked back at the straps. The morning had no use for that thought. He tightened one buckle, loose enough to move, firm enough to hold. Enough. The flight decks had not yet come fully alive, but they were no longer empty night spaces. On Enterprise, men began moving aircraft into position under controlled darkness. Deck crews worked in low light, their shirts not yet bright with daylight. Yellow for plane handlers, red for ordnance, purple for fuel, green for catapults and maintenance details. In the dimness before dawn, the colours were muted, almost hidden, but the men knew their own work and the work of those beside them. Hand signals mattered, small gestures mattered, a palm down, a finger point, a light swung low, a wheel chock pulled. A wingtip watched carefully in the dark. The deck smelled of salt wind, high-octane gasoline, oil, rubber tyres, warm engines, metal fittings, rope, and coffee carried upward from below. The carrier turned slightly into the wind. A man on the deck felt the change first in the air against his face, then in the way voices carried, then in the slight adjustment of bodies that had learned the ship's movement without needing to speak of it. An aircraft rolled forward under guidance. Its tyres made a low sound across the deck. A mechanic walked beside the wing, one hand raised near the surface without touching it. Another man watched the tail. Nothing was hurried. Everything was urgent. That difference mattered. Hurry belonged to panic. Urgency belonged to work. On Hornet, deck crews began the same quiet choreography. The sea wind moved across the flight deck in long, steady strokes. The sky above the eastern horizon was beginning to lose its blackness, though no gold had entered it yet. Aircraft were still silhouettes, wildcats with compact strength, devastators heavier and slower in outline, dauntlesses waiting with folded purpose. To a man standing at the edge of the deck, the ocean looked endless and nearly invisible. The wake behind the carrier glowed faint green in places, then disappeared into the black. The Pacific did not hold marks long. A sailor in a yellow shirt crouched to check a wheel chock. Another stood with arms folded against the wind, waiting for a signal. A purple-shirted fuel crewman wiped his hand on a rag and looked at a gauge. A man in red carried out his task with the careful movements of someone handling work that did not forgive carelessness. The deck was a place of many trades at once. Men who knew aircraft, men who knew engines, men who knew fuel, men who knew signals, men who knew how to make a crowded deck move without becoming confused. No one on that deck needed to think of the whole battle. The whole battle was too large. Each man had his own part: the wheel, the chock, the hose, the signal, the strap, the propeller arc, the wingtip, the man beside him. This was how large mornings began. Not all at once. One practiced motion after another. On Yorktown, the first aircraft moved under a sky turning from black to deep indigo. A deck officer looked down the length of the flight deck and saw men becoming shapes against a slowly paling world. The carrier's island rose beside them. The sea wind carried speech backward. A man leaned close to hear another. Two mechanics stood near a Dauntless while its engine was checked. One held a clipboard. The other listened to the engine as if it were a man speaking in a low voice. The propeller turned slowly at first, then stopped, then turned again under instruction. The smell of gasoline sharpened. A faint exhaust drifted and was taken quickly by the wind. Below decks, men continued to wake, move, climb, and prepare. Above decks, the ship's body began to focus on the launch that would come with light. Far away from the carriers, the Catalinas kept working through the last dark. The search had become grey at the edges. For hours, Daniel Reeves and Ellis Morgan had watched an ocean that gave them little. Now the surface slowly changed. Black water became dark blue. Cloud edges became visible. The line between sea and sky emerged faintly, then disappeared again under haze. The cockpit instruments still glowed green, but that glow had less authority than before. Morning was beginning to compete with it. Ellis rubbed his eyes, then forced himself to scan again. Fatigue had become a physical thing behind his forehead, a pressure, a dryness, a heaviness in the neck. He wanted to close his eyes for 1 minute. He did not. Daniel held course and listened to the engines. After so many hours, even a normal engine could begin to sound suspicious if a man listened too hard. He checked the gauges. Steady. Fuel within expectation. Course held. Nothing to report yet. The coffee had gone beyond cold into something almost separate from coffee. Ellis drank from his cup anyway. Still useful, Daniel said. Ellis looked at him. I did not say that. You looked like you were thinking it. I was thinking it has failed every standard except being wet. Daniel accepted the correction. A few minutes later, neither man remembered the exchange clearly. The patrol continued. Another Catalina, farther along a different sector, moved through a patch of low cloud and came out into paler air. The men inside saw the ocean open below them, wide and indifferent. The observer searched for straight lines on a surface made of curves. A wake, a ship's shadow, a formation, anything not belonging to waves. Most of what he saw belonged to waves. He made another note. No contact. The words were dry, almost dull. But the hand that wrote them was doing important work, whether or not the line felt important in the moment. On Midway, dawn approached before it arrived. The gooney birds knew it first, or seemed to. They began moving with more purpose through the sand and scrub. Their calls crossed the atoll in uneven intervals. The surf on the reef turned from black sound to grey movement. White water appeared along the coral edge. Palm trunks separated themselves from darkness. Fuel drums became round shapes rather than shadows. The runway on Eastern Island emerged slowly, pale and flat. Men who had worked through the night looked at it as if it belonged to someone else. Samuel Price stood near a low wall of sandbags and drank from a cup that had once held coffee and now held mostly warmth without flavour. He had read his unfinished letter again and decided not to add anything before daylight. The line about the birds still pleased him. The line about the ocean still felt too large, but true. He folded the paper and placed it back in his pocket. A Marine beside him named Harris held a harmonica but did not play it. He turned it over in his hands, closed it, opened it, then closed it again. Samuel looked at it. You ever play that thing? Not before breakfast. It's almost breakfast. Then I'm nearly in danger. Samuel smiled. The smile faded naturally, without sadness. They both looked toward the runway. A truck crossed slowly. A man waved it forward. Somewhere, an aircraft engine coughed once and then settled. The smell of aviation fuel thickened as the air warmed. Salt, coral dust, fuel, coffee, damp canvas, seabirds, tobacco, and the first heat of a tropical morning. Midway was still small. It was still a flat atoll in an ocean far too large for comfort. But as dawn approached, small places became sharper. A stack of crates, a radio mast, a tent flap, a runway marker, a bird standing exactly where a man wanted to walk, a canteen hanging from a post, a map weighted by a stone, a rifle leaning against a wall. The world returned in pieces. Far northwest, the Japanese carriers also moved toward dawn. On Akagi, Hiroshi Tanaka had returned to work, then stopped only when another man told him there was nothing more for that aircraft at that hour. He accepted this with difficulty. Some men trust rest less than labour. He moved toward a place where he could drink something hot. The ship's passageways were more active now. Men awake, men preparing, men carrying equipment, men speaking in short, practical phrases. The night had thinned, and with it the illusion that time might stretch forever. A mechanic can work all night and still be surprised when morning arrives. On Kaga, Kenji Sato stood near a compartment entrance and adjusted his scarf. He had slept less than he wanted, more than he expected. His photograph and lucky charm were secure inside his pocket. He checked them once, not by looking, but by touch. The gesture was hidden inside the ordinary adjustment of his clothing. A man beside him drank from a small cup and made a face. Kenji said nothing. The man looked at the cup, then said, "Not good." Kenji answered, "Hot." The man considered. Yes, hot. That was enough. The Japanese ships had their own morning smells now. Rice, tea, fuel, oil, salt wind, metal, smoke, canvas, sweat, paper, and warm engines. Their own low voices, their own watches changing, their own aircraft being prepared, their own maps under lamps, their own pilots coming awake. The same human mechanics of a carrier morning moved beneath different flags and different language. On Soryu, the radio room remained focused. Dawn did not end listening. The headphones stayed pressed to ears. The logs remained open. The pencils still moved. The operator who had listened through static all night now felt the edge of fatigue behind his eyes. He wrote carefully because careless writing at dawn could undo clear listening at night. On Hiryu, the sailor who had watched the wake earlier, crossed the deck under a paling sky and saw the ocean now as a surface again. Not just darkness, a real sea, moving, wide, dull blue in the low light. The green wake was gone because the sky had begun to show enough of the water without it. For a moment this made the night feel distant. Then the ship's work drew him back. There was always another task. The Pacific night had hidden both fleets from each other. Now it began to loosen that covering. Not reveal everything, not yet. Only withdraw slowly, the way darkness leaves the sea by degrees. The American carriers, the Japanese carriers, the patrol planes and Midway itself were all moving into the same morning without sharing the same knowledge. Each group had pieces. No one had the whole. That is how history often feels when lived from inside it. Not like a completed map, more like a table covered in fragments, a report from a patrol, a position estimate, a sighting not yet received, a course change, a clock, a fuel level, a man saying the coffee is bad, a photograph pressed flat inside a pocket, a letter still unfinished. On Enterprise, Walter Ames stood near the edge of the hangar deck and watched an aircraft elevator rise. The platform carried a plane upward toward the flight deck. Light from above fell around it as it moved. The aircraft seemed to ascend into a different world. Below, the hangar still belonged to lamps and shadows. Above, the flight deck belonged to wind and dawn. Walter had done his work. There was always more work, but not on that machine at that moment. He drank from a cup gone lukewarm and watched until the elevator reached the deck. Burke came beside him. "You sleep at all?" Walter shook his head. "Later?" Burke made a small sound. Later was a word men used at sea when they did not know what else to say. It meant perhaps. It meant not now. It meant the body would wait because the ship had asked it to. On Hornet, Jack Ralston folded his unfinished letter and placed it inside his jacket. He did not know why he moved it from under the map to his pocket. Perhaps because the room was changing now. Maps were no longer quiet objects on tables. They were being used, folded, carried, interpreted. Coffee cups were emptied. Cigarettes were crushed. Men stood and checked themselves. Flight jacket, dog tags, pencil, mapboard, gloves, life vest, parachute. A man patted his pockets in the exact rhythm of someone counting a private list. Another asked for a pencil. A third gave him one without looking. Avery stood by the door and waited for the line of men ahead to move. He looked back at the room, the chairs, the table, the red lamp, the pack of cards left behind. For a strange second, the ready room seemed more peaceful than it had all night. Perhaps because waiting was ending. Not ending completely, only changing shape. On Yorktown, Robert Hale stepped into the passage with his gear and felt the ship more clearly through his boots. The carrier was awake now, not fully in daylight, but awake. Men moved with purpose in both directions. A sailor carried a bundle of charts. Another moved past with a coil of cable. A third stood aside to let pilots through. No one wasted space. The passage smelled of coffee, metal, leather, sweat, oil, and morning air drawn down from above. Robert climbed toward the flight deck and felt the temperature change before he reached it. The air opened. Wind touched his face. The sky above the deck had turned from indigo to a pale grey blue. The horizon still held no gold, but it was coming. Aircraft waited in ordered lines. Deck crews moved around them, colours emerging now as light grew. Yellow, red, purple, green, still muted, soon brighter. A man signalled with both hands. Another crouched near a wheel. A mechanic leaned into a cockpit. The first engine coughed, turned, caught, and then settled into a rough idle that shook the air around it. Then another farther down the deck. The sound did not become battle. Not yet. It was morning work, engines warming, men checking, hands moving, signals passing, the choreography of a carrier waking into flight. On Midway, Samuel heard aircraft engines and looked toward Eastern Island. The sky was light enough now for the birds to look almost white against the sand. The gooney birds moved among the structures as if refusing to be impressed by the human morning. One stood near a path, blocking two Marines carrying equipment. The men went around it. No one argued. The bird had the confidence of an older owner. Samuel drank the last of the weak coffee in his cup. It had cooled. He swallowed it anyway. Harris slipped the harmonica into his pocket. "You never played it." "Not breakfast yet." Samuel looked at the brightening sky. "Soon. Then I'll stay careful." They stood together, listening. The surf on the reef, engines near the runway, birds, voices, a truck rolling over coral ground, a radio call from inside a hut, the atoll waking inside the immense Pacific. A listener far away could imagine Midway as only a dot on a map. But a man standing there felt each small thing. The grit under the boot, the salt on the lips, the heat gathering early, the bird cry, the smell of fuel, the paper folded in a pocket, the knowledge that there was water in every direction. Out over the ocean, Daniel Reeves's Catalina flew into a greyer world. The cockpit green no longer dominated. Morning entered the glass. The water below showed texture now. Long swells, cloud shadows, white streaks where wind touched the surface. Ellis kept scanning, tired beyond complaint. The ocean did not become smaller because it was visible. In daylight it only showed more of itself. More waves, more distance, more emptiness. A ship could still hide in it. A wake could still vanish. A report could still come late. Daniel checked his wristwatch, then the fuel, then the horizon. The search continued for a little longer before they would return or extend according to orders and fuel. He thought of the photograph near the map case, his wife on the porch, the blurred dog. He didn't touch it this time. The morning had begun to demand both hands. The Pacific stretched under them, warm and enormous, no more helpful in grey light than it had been in black. On the American carriers, the pilots moved toward their aircraft. Not all at once, not in a rush. A line here, a pause there, a man stepping around a fuel hose, another ducking under a wing, a third handing a note to someone who would not read it until later. The deck crews guided them through the controlled complexity of the flight deck. The wind strengthened over the bow. The engines grew louder as more aircraft came alive. The smell of gasoline sharpened into the morning. Jack Ralston climbed into his cockpit and settled into the space that would soon become the centre of his world. He adjusted himself by habit. Straps, harness, controls, goggles, gloves, mapboard. He did not think in long sentences. A cockpit before launch was too practical for that. He checked what needed checking, touched the place where the letter sat inside his jacket, then left it alone. A deck crewman leaned in, said something short, received a nod, and moved away. Avery climbed into his own aircraft nearby. On Yorktown, Robert Hale did the same. On Enterprise, other pilots settled into seats while mechanics gave final looks that were less inspection than farewell. Walter Ames stood back from the aircraft he had checked and watched the pilot climb in. The pilot did not know how long Walter had spent with that panel. He did not need to. The trust had already passed between them without words. The sky turned pearl at the horizon. Then pale gold began to gather under the grey. The Pacific, which had been black and then indigo and then blue-grey, started to take light along the tops of waves. The carriers moved into wind. Midway brightened behind them and beyond them. The Japanese carriers moved under the same dawn elsewhere on the ocean. The patrol planes continued their search. The morning was no longer waiting outside the story. It had arrived at the edge of every deck, every cockpit, every island hut, every radio room, and every watch station. Still, for one more moment, the aircraft remained on the decks, engines warming, hands signalling, men breathing. The launch had not yet begun. The famous morning was still held in its first light, and for that brief edge of time, before wheels rolled and wings lifted into the dawn, the Pacific held everything in a single quiet breath. The first aircraft did not lift from the deck at once. Morning came in stages. First the sky changed, then the sea, then the ships, then the men. On the horizon, the black of night softened into indigo. Indigo became blue-grey. Blue-grey became pearl. And beneath the low edge of cloud, a pale gold began to gather, faint at first, as if the morning were deciding how much of itself to reveal. The Pacific changed with it. The water no longer looked like ink. It showed long swells now, lines of wind, dark blue hollows, grey crests, a faint sheen of gold where the light touched the tops of waves. The ocean seemed more visible, but not smaller. Daylight did not reduce her. It only showed the size more clearly. On the flight deck of Yorktown, the wind came steady over the bow. Aircraft waited in ordered lines. Engines warmed one by one, each sound joining the larger sound of the ship and the sea. A cough, a turn, a rough start, a settling rhythm, then another and another. Deck crews moved among them with practiced care. The colours of their shirts became clearer as the light grew. Yellow for plane handlers, red for ordnance, purple for fuel, green for catapult and maintenance crews, blue and white elsewhere on the deck. In the dark, they had been muted figures. Now they became moving points of colour against grey metal, pale wood, sea wind, and the first light of dawn. No one moved without purpose. A man in yellow gave a signal with both hands. Another watched a wingtip pass close to the island. A purple-shirted crewman checked a fuel line, then stepped back. A mechanic leaned toward a cockpit, spoke a few words, listened, nodded, and moved away. Chocks were pulled, hands rose, hands lowered, a wheel turned a little, a pilot adjusted his straps, a propeller blurred. The deck seemed crowded, but it was not disorder. It was choreography. Not beautiful in the ornamental sense. Beautiful in the way necessary work can be beautiful when many people know their tasks and trust the next man to know his. Robert Hale sat in his cockpit and felt the aircraft come alive around him. The engine's vibration entered his shoulders, his chest, his hands. He checked the instruments, he checked the harness, he checked the map board. He looked once across the deck and saw other aircraft waiting in the same pale morning. He did not think of history. A man inside a cockpit has little room for history. He thought of the next signal, the wind, the engine, the feel of the controls, the deck ahead. Somewhere beneath his jacket, his dog tags rested against his shirt. The small sound they made when he moved was lost now under the engine. Still, he knew they were there. That was enough. On Hornet, Jack Ralston waited with one hand near the throttle and the other steady on the controls. The unfinished letter to his father was inside his jacket pocket. He had moved it there before leaving the ready room. He did not know why the action had mattered, only that it had. The ready room behind him was already becoming part of another hour. The red lamp, the table, the ashtray, the cards left behind, the pencil that had rolled under a chair, the coffee cup beside the map. All of it remained in his mind for a moment, small and still. Then the deck crewman gave a signal. Jack looked forward. The ocean was no longer a dark idea around the ship. It was a living surface ahead. Wind crossed the deck. The carrier moved into it. A plane ahead of him began its run. For a few seconds, wheels rolled over the deck, engine climbing, wings gathering morning air. Then the aircraft lifted, not dramatically from where Jack sat, only steadily. It left the deck and became part of the sky. The next aircraft moved forward. The morning had begun. On Enterprise, Walter Ames stood back from the Dauntless he had checked through the night. The pilot had climbed in, the engine had started. The aircraft now belonged to the deck, the pilot, the air, and whatever the day required. Walter held a coffee cup that had gone lukewarm. He had not meant to keep holding it. His hands had simply closed around it while he watched. Burke stood beside him, arms folded, eyes narrowed against the wind. "That one's yours," Burke said. Walter did not answer immediately. A mechanic knows an aircraft is never really his. He touches it. He checks it. He trusts his hands. Then it leaves. Still, he watched as if some part of himself had been bolted inside the panel he had checked. The deck officer signalled. The Dauntless began rolling. Slow at first, then faster. Its engine rose over the deck noise. Wind took the exhaust back. The wheels crossed the painted surface. Then the aircraft lifted from Enterprise into dawn. Walter watched it climb. He did not say anything grand. He took one drink of cold coffee and made a face. Burke saw this. Bad. Useful. That's what you said before. Still true. They stood a moment longer in the wind. Then there was another aircraft to think about. Another task. Another piece of the morning. The launches continued. Not as one single motion, but as a sequence of small permissions. A signal. A roll. A lift. A space cleared. A new aircraft positioned. A hand raised. A hand dropped. Engines turning. Wind moving. Men stepping away at the correct moment. The carriers did not shout themselves into morning. They worked into it. Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown. 3 great ships moving through the Central Pacific, each one sending aircraft into a sky that had only recently belonged to stars. Around them, cruisers and destroyers held their stations. The formation shifted with the sea and the work of command. Wakes trailed white now, no longer glowing green as they had in the night. The pale, living light of phosphorescence had vanished into daylight, but the ship still left marks for a moment. White water behind them. Foam, opening, then fading. The Pacific closed over every wake. On Midway, the first full light had reached Sand Island and Eastern Island. The atoll looked almost too small for the morning it was holding. Coral sand glared softly under the low sun. The runway stood pale and flat. Fuel drums cast short shadows. Palm leaves stirred in the warm air. The surf on the reef turned white and restless. The gooney birds moved through the human world as if the entire military presence were an inconvenience built around their older routines. One bird stood near a path and forced 2 Marines to detour. Neither argued. The island had its own chain of command, and the bird seemed to be high in it. Samuel Price stood outside with a coffee cup in one hand and his unfinished letter in his pocket. The coffee had cooled. He drank it anyway because morning had made the cup useful again. Harris came beside him, the harmonica still unseen in his pocket. "You ever going to play that?" Samuel said. Harris looked toward the runway. "Not now." "When?" "When nobody's listening." Samuel nodded. "That may be difficult here." The atoll was too small for privacy. Every sound seemed to cross it. Surf, birds, trucks, engines, voices, tools, radios, boots on coral, tin cups set down on crates, the faint flap of canvas in the warm wind. Harris took the cup when Samuel offered it. He drank, grimaced slightly and handed it back. "Coffee's gone." It was never fully there. They stood together under the growing heat. The morning had not made the atoll less remote. It had only made its details clearer. The fuel smell sharpened. The birds became louder. The water beyond the reef showed blue and white rather than black. The Pacific surrounded Midway in every direction, wide enough to make the island seem like a handful of sand placed on a moving world. Inside the communications hut, men worked under lamps that were no longer stronger than daylight. Headphones stayed on. Logs stayed open. Reports moved. Messages came and went. A man wrote carefully because fatigue made the hand careless if allowed. Another leaned over a map where the atoll looked almost ridiculous in scale. A dot surrounded by vast water and drawn lines. The men in Pearl Harbor who had listened to radio waves were far away, but their work remained present in every map and every expectation. Station Hypo did not appear on the atoll like a building or a ship. It appeared as placement, as warning, as the feeling that the night had not been empty, even when the ocean had looked empty. On a PBY Catalina returning from a long patrol, Daniel Reeves watched the morning spread over the water ahead. His eyes felt dry. His shoulders ached from holding the same posture too long. The engines had become so constant that he almost did not hear them until they changed slightly. Ellis Morgan sat beside him, still scanning even when the sector had nearly run its course. The cup of coffee between them had become undrinkable by every ordinary standard. Neither threw it away. It had become part of the cockpit, a bitter little object that had crossed the night with them. Ellis made one more note. No contact. He looked at the words. Flat words. Useful words. Words that did not tell the whole story of staring into black water until the eyes burned. Daniel glanced at the note. Clean line. Ellis said, "Only thing clean in here?" That was nearly a joke, nearly enough. The aircraft continued toward Midway, carrying its empty report with the same seriousness it would have carried a sighting. Another Catalina farther out still searched. Another watched a different patch of ocean. Another crew saw cloud shadows and foam lines and long surfaces of nothing. The Pacific made every answer expensive. Men paid with hours, fuel, eyes, patience, and the dull ache of staying awake. The patrol planes did not own the morning. They only crossed it slowly. Large wings, steady engines, green instrument glow fading as daylight entered the glass. Maps clipped down, pencils worn short, headphones pressing sore places behind the ears. A cigarette smoked only halfway because the observer needed both hands. A photograph tucked near a map case. A canteen rolling gently against a boot. The routine of the long search continued even as carrier decks elsewhere came alive. Far northwest, the Japanese carriers had also entered dawn. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Their decks awakened under the same Pacific light. The same shift from black to grey to pearl, the same smell of fuel and hot metal, the same low voices turned sharper by morning work, the same small objects held in pockets and lockers, the same young men climbing into aircraft, adjusting gear, checking straps, receiving signals and listening to engines warm. There was no need to make them larger or smaller than they were. They were men on ships at dawn. On Akagi, Hiroshi Tanaka stood under growing light and watched final preparations with hands that still smelled of oil. He had slept almost not at all. His eyes hurt, his back hurt. But the work on the aircraft near him was complete enough to leave his hands. A pilot stepped past him. Hiroshi moved aside. For a moment he noticed the pilot's scarf tucked carefully into his jacket. A small tidy gesture in the middle of a ship becoming busy. The detail stayed with him. Not because it meant anything grand, because the mind sometimes holds one small image when the wider morning is too large. On Kaga, Kenji Sato touched the pocket where his photograph and charm rested. He did it once, quickly, a private check hidden inside the motion of adjusting his clothing. The deck air was warm, but wind made it feel cooler against the face. He looked toward the horizon, then back to the aircraft and the men around him. The ocean was visible now, not friendly, not hostile, only endless. A man beside him lifted a cup and drank the last of something hot. He made the same small face men make on all ships, when the drink has failed but still has temperature. Kenji saw it and almost smiled. That human grimace crossed languages, flags and oceans. On Soryu, the radio room did not relax because dawn had arrived. The headphones remained pressed to ears. Paper remained on desks. A pencil moved carefully. The room was lit by a mix of instrument glow and natural light working its way through the ship. The man writing had to slow his hand because tiredness made letters run together. Clear writing mattered. A number written badly could travel badly. A report confused could become more dangerous than silence. So he wrote slowly. On Hiryu, the sailor who had watched the green wake in darkness now saw only blue water behind the ship. The glow had vanished, but he remembered it. For a moment he thought of how the ocean forgot ships at night, how the wake vanished almost as soon as it formed. Then he turned back to work. The deck had no use for thoughts that did not help a man move safely. The Pacific night had hidden both fleets. Morning was removing the cover, slowly and unevenly. It did not reveal everything at once. It never does. Reports would come. Sightings would change assumptions. Aircraft would leave decks. Men would make decisions from pieces, not from the completed history that later readers would hold. Inside the morning, no one had the whole shape, only what stood in front of him. A signal, a map, a compass, a fuel gauge, a runway, a wing, a radio log, a coffee cup, a letter in a pocket. The launch from the American carriers continued into stronger light. On Enterprise, another aircraft rolled forward. The deck crewman's hand dropped. The engine climbed. Wheels moved. The aircraft gathered speed and lifted away. The next took its place. The entire flight deck seemed to breathe with intervals. Position, signal, run, lift, clear, again. The choreography repeated until repetition itself became calming. Not calm in the sense of ease, calm in the sense of known motion. Men understood where to stand, when to move, when to raise a hand, when to step back, when to trust the pilot, the engine, the deck, the wind. On Hornet, Jack Ralston's aircraft moved toward its turn. He looked down the deck and saw the pale sky beyond the bow. The deck was not long enough for doubt, which was perhaps a mercy. A carrier launch compresses thought. The mind narrows. Engine, signal, wind, deck, air. He heard the engine more through his bones than his ears. He saw a yellow-shirted man signal ahead. He saw another step away. The aircraft before him lifted. The deck ahead opened. His hand settled. The signal came. Wheels rolled. The deck rushed beneath him. For one brief second, the ship, the ocean, the aircraft, and the morning seemed to hold one breath. Then the wheels left the deck. The carrier fell away beneath him. The Pacific opened ahead. He was airborne in the grey-gold light. The letter stayed in his jacket. The photograph stayed in the pocket. His father and brother remained far away beside their car, still in that ordinary day the camera had kept. On Yorktown, Robert Hale felt the same narrowing. Everything that had filled the ready room, the passageway, the deck, and the long night became simple in the moment of movement. The aircraft rolled. Wind pressed. The bow of the carrier approached, then dropped behind. Air took the wings. He rose into morning. Below him, Yorktown moved on, sending another aircraft after him. The wake spread white behind her and softened into the sea. Farther away, other ships held formation. The Pacific lay enormous in every direction. A pilot could not hold that size for long. He looked to the next practical thing: altitude, formation, course, instruments, fuel. The morning required steps, only steps. On Enterprise, Walter Ames watched the aircraft he had checked become smaller in the air. Burke beside him said nothing. The two mechanics stood shoulder to shoulder until the next noise on deck pulled their attention away. A mechanic does not have the luxury of following one aircraft into the sky with his whole heart. There is another machine, another task, another oil mark, another panel, another cable, another tool count. The work continues because the deck continues. Walter set down the coffee cup, now empty, and returned to the line of tasks waiting for him. Above, aircraft formed and turned into the morning. Below, the carriers moved through water older than every name in the story. The Pacific accepted the launches without comment. She had seen birds lift from islands for ages beyond counting. She had seen storms rise and vanish. She had seen canoes, sailing ships, steamers, fishing boats, liners, warships, and wreckage. Now she saw aircraft rising from steel decks, carrying young men into a morning that would soon become larger than any one of them. The ocean did not make the morning meaningful. People would do that later, with reports, with numbers, with names, with memorials, with books, with maps, with stories. For now, it was simply morning. The dawn became brighter. Pearl entered gold. Gold touched the tops of waves. Clouds opened and closed. The carriers slid through wind. Aircraft moved outward into the sky. Midway's reef shone white. The gooney birds called over coral sand. Catalinas droned across distant sectors. Japanese carriers moved under the same light somewhere beyond sight. The known battle was beginning to form, but this story does not follow it into noise. It stays with the threshold. The quiet hours before and the first work of dawn. The human details before the map becomes crowded. A coffee cup left in a ready room, a pack of cards on a chair, a pencil mark on a navigation plot, a leather jacket creased at the shoulder, a photograph in a wallet, a dog tag against skin, a life vest checked twice, a mechanic's hand on a panel, a radio operator writing slowly, a marine folding a letter on Midway, a gooney bird stepping through the path as if nothing urgent existed in all the world, and perhaps to the bird nothing did. Hours later, the Battle of Midway would become one of the turning points of the Pacific War. The sentence is true. It is also too large for the men inside the First Light. They did not wake into a turning point. They woke into tasks. They woke into coffee, maps, engines, briefings, wind over a flight deck, the smell of gasoline, the feel of straps under the fingers, the sight of a horizon becoming pale. The morning became history only after it had first been morning. If you're still listening, you do not need to follow the aircraft any farther. You do not need to hold the whole ocean. You do not need to remember every carrier. Let the names soften now. Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Midway, Sand Island, Eastern Island. The names can drift apart like wakes fading behind ships. The Pacific is still there, warm, wide, ancient, breathing beneath the light. The ships begin to fade now, not suddenly, slowly. The flight decks grow distant. The coloured shirts become small movements. The engines become a low sound far away. The maps close. The coffee cools. The ready rooms empty. The hangar decks fall back into shadow. The radio rooms continue to listen, but softer now, farther now. The atoll fades too. The runway becomes a pale line. The fuel drums become round shadows. The palms become dark strokes against the sky. The gooney birds continue walking through coral sand, unhurried and unimpressed. The surf moves over the reef. White water, then back. White water, then back. The Catalinas become distant silhouettes, then only engine sound, then memory. The carriers move beyond the edge of sight. Their wakes open, brighten, break, disappear. The Pacific closes gently over every line. Breathe in softly, breathe out slowly. Let the body grow heavier. Let the hands rest. Let the jaw loosen. There is no map to hold now, no watch to keep, no signal to read, no course to calculate, no aircraft to follow, only water, only sky, only the soft fading of a long night into morning. The Pacific breathed in, the Pacific breathed out. The dawn became morning, the morning became history. And somewhere in the long, warm night that came before, men slept on steel beds beneath the stars. A coffee cup cooled beside a map. A pencil lay still on a navigation plot. A letter waited unfinished under red light. A photograph rested in a wallet. A mechanic counted his tools and found them all. A pilot touched a pocket and closed his eyes again. A marine on Midway listened to the surf. A gooney bird crossed the sand with older rights than any man there. The ocean held them all. Not because she understood them, not because she chose them, only because the ocean is large enough to hold what men cannot. Breathe in softly, breathe out slowly. The watch is still being kept somewhere far away. The sea is still moving. The ships are only shadows now. The aircraft are only distant points. The island is only a pale ring under stars. The night is still here if you need it. Warm enough, dark enough, quiet enough, you can rest. The Pacific breathed in, the Pacific breathed out. The stars softened. The water moved. The watch bell rang softly in another time, and the quiet hours before dawn settled back into the wide, warm sea.